Awesome. Hello and welcome to the 9th Neuroscience Public Lecture Series. This event is held twice a year, both in the fall and the spring, so we hope we have a few returning people, as well as if you're new, we hope that you come in the future. This event is unique in that it's entirely organized by neuroscience graduate students and is funded by the Mahoney Institute of Neuroscience. Tonight we feature 3 speakers who will be giving 15 to 20-minute talks from our own distinguished Penn faculty. Those speakers are Josh Gold, Michael Platt, and Eitan Green. So just a quick question for all you out there. How many of you are scientists? All right, very cool. And how many of you are non-neuroscientists? Oh, awesome. Thanks so much for coming. So this event is really meant to foster communication between the researchers at Penn and the greater Philadelphia community, and as well as anyone watching on YouTube, and really let you know what we're doing here at Penn and what kind of research we're doing and how it works. So if you have any questions, we would love to hear them. After each speaker gives their talk, you'll be able to ask a question, so just look to the aisle and look for someone that's carrying a microphone, or if you wait till afterwards, the speakers will be around, you can talk to them then. And if you looked around earlier, you saw you're surrounded by some scientists near you, you can go mingle with some of them as well. So one more question. Has anyone here ever made a decision before? All right, a few in the back. Okay, well, I'm sure when you were making a decision to come to this event, you were sort of wondering, what is neuroeconomics exactly? So neuroeconomics is basically what it sounds like. It combines principles from neuroscience with economics, but also psychology. So in other words, it uses the mechanisms and understanding that we have from neuroscience to ask questions and answer questions from psychology and economics, specifically individual and group level decision making. And right now what I'm going to do is take you through each of those fields and tell you a little bit about it. Since we are at a neuroscience public lecture, I'll start with the neuroscientist's favorite subject, which is the brain. So the brain is a complex organ composed of billions of little cells called neurons, and these neurons all communicate with each other and build up into what ultimately becomes your experience of the world. Different parts of the brain do different functions, and what neuroscientists do is they study these regions of the brain to figure out what exactly it is that they do. Now, there are many methods in neuroscience, but the 3 main methods that you'll see in decision-making studies I'll go through right now. On the smallest scale, we can do neural recordings, and this involves inserting a metal electrode into the brain and actually recording the electrical activity from one or a small group of neurons. This method is extremely precise to the location, and it's also very precise in its timing to the order of milliseconds. With this, that means you can tell exactly what a neuron's doing in response to any sort of event or stimulus from the outside world. So it's a very powerful tool, but it's invasive, making it limited mostly to animal models and only special cases of human studies. Another method is EEG, which is electroencephalography. This method is able to record the electrical activity of a lot of neurons, like a huge number of neurons, over large space, such as the whole brain or a large portion of it. This method could be invasive, but is usually used non-invasively for human studies and decision making. And it's also very precise in its timing to the order of milliseconds, but again, it's not very precise in its location of where the activity is happening. A third very common technique in decision-making studies is fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. This is a non-invasive technique that is used to measure neural activity by the proxy of blood oxygenation level. So basically, the idea behind this is that as a lot of neurons become very active, they use up a lot of energy, and to compensate for this, your body sends oxygen and nutrient-rich blood to that area. And this allows researchers to measure that change in specific locations across the brain in an MRI scanner. And so what they'll do is put someone in a scanner, ask them to do some type of tasks, and see which area of the brain is changing, such as this one, where they've asked people to contemplate winning or losing in a gambling task. So now that I've told you about the sort of techniques and findings that are used in decision making from neuroscience, let's talk about how this can apply to studying individual and group level decision making, such as in psychology and economics. And I'll begin with individual level decision making as it pertains from the field of psychology. So the two main schools of thought that neuroeconomics draws upon from psychology are behaviorism and reward processing and perceptual decision making. And so behaviorism is really the foundation of reward processing studies. It was founded by B.F. Skinner in the early 20th century and has really served as a foundation of how we study reward decision making. The behaviorism is really epitomized by this picture of a pigeon in a box. So this is not just any box, this is a Skinner box, and in this box the pigeon can learn to poke to the holes on the right and receive a food pellet. So receiving this food pellet is a positive reinforcer, he gets a reward, but if he pokes the wrong hole, he might receive a small shock from the floor, and that would be a negative reinforcer or a punishment. And so this idea of shaping an animal's behavior from a positive or negatively reinforcing event is the whole essence of behaviorism. So a sort of like human example of this might be a vending machine, where you've learned to complete this action to get a food reward. However, as you can kind of guess from the vending machine, reward processing is more complicated than just what is part of behavior, which is shaping behavior, but also you're taking into account the different options you have when looking at a vending machine with your previous experiences with all these different foods or drinks and your state of being hungry or thirsty. So you take all these into account when you're actually making a reward-related decision. The areas of the brain that are usually implicated in reward decision-making are the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system. The prefrontal cortex is the site of executive and rational decision-making. The basal ganglia is involved in reward evaluation association with actions and outcomes, and the limbic system is involved with, again, reward evaluation as well as the emotional aspect of reward processing. So that wraps up for reward processing. There's also perceptual decision making. This is a little bit different in that it entails studying how we look at something around our environment, a certain stimulus, and perceive it, and how we make a judgment about that stimulus. So this field was sort of born out of visual studies, and so it uses how and what we see as its main stimulus set, and will adjust a certain object to make it more or less clear and ask you to make a judgment about it. Intuitively, you can kind of think of this as what you do when you're gardening. So you're looking at a tomato, and you see the shape and the color of the tomato, so you perceive those aspects of it, but you're also taking into account your previous experience with eating tomatoes, and you know which color tomato is good, which shape of a tomato is good to pick, and so from that you can decide what tomatoes to pick. Another example is deciding how fast moving water is. This picture is really just a bunch of lines and colors and shapes, but you are able to take all that evidence and judge how fast the water is moving and to make a decision if the water is safe to cross. So if any of you have ever played Oregon Trail, you might know that's pretty crucial because it makes a difference between you safely crossing the river or sadly rolling over and losing all your items and possibly your party. So the brain regions that are involved with this kind of decision making are typically the visual cortex, associated parietal regions with visual processing, and the frontal cortex, which as I said before is executive decision making. All right, so I've told you now about how we can study individual decision making. How does that relate to more of a group level setting between individuals or in a big population? And so that brings in the principles we know from economics. So when you're thinking about individuals interacting with each other, you can use a lot of the principles from game theory. So the basic idea of this is, how do people come up with strategies to either cooperate or compete to reach a certain objective? Another set of principles from economics is just classical economics. And This has taught us a lot about how people value and make decisions about objects by using data from a lot of people. And we can use that to inform how an individual makes a decision. What neuroeconomicists try to do is take the process that one individual makes and study what the underlying brain activity is and use that to make a prediction of how they would value and what kind of cost they would kind of give up to then purchase, say, like a product and see how that would play in the market. So for example, if you study the brain activity of someone listening to a song, how well will that song then do in the broader scale market just based off of their brain activity? All right, so with this, with this introduction, I hope you've reached an understanding that neuroeconomics is a special hybrid of a lot of different questions and principles and findings from different fields. And so our three speakers tonight will be talking about their different roles in decision making and the research they've done to study the underlying mechanisms behind it. All right,